this, but SABMiller Coors as it stands now, or SABMiller, and AB-Inbev. What is this mega brew thing all about?
Yeah, so I would say just 10,000 foot view. This is probably the deal that could really solidify the landscape in the industry in a way that could have very negative implications for beer drinkers and smaller innovative craft brewers. Why? Because we've had a lot of consolidation in beer. We've got Anheuser-Busch, which has, is now itself the product of multiple consolidations, mergers before now. Right now, AB-Inbev has about 45% of the U.S. beer market. So let's just talk about the U.S., okay? In 2008, Miller and Coors came together and formed a joint venture, which is, in effect, a merger. They have about 26% of the market. So you got a big player, 45%, AB-Inbev. You got Miller Coors with 26%. And then you got a sort of a little fringe of smaller players like Constellation and Heineken and Pabst. By the way, Pabst is brewed by Miller Coors. They don't brew their own beer. They have a contract brewing arrangement. There's Boston Beer in there with like 2% of the market. Yuengling is in there, 1.4%, and it goes down from there. But the point is, you got a landscape in the United States where you've got a big kahuna firm with 45%, and then you have this JV. Well, what happened was after the Miller Coors JV was formed some 8 years ago, prices went up for beer. And we now have some economic evidence, some studies that have been done, and the Department of Justice, the Antitrust enforcer that is looking at this deal, has actually publicly cited to the fact that prices went up after the Miller Coors JV because AB-Inbev and Miller Coors were sort of coordinating on price. In other words, they weren't competing hard with one another, and sort of out there duking it out and figuring out who could be the most competitive and produce the highest quality products and bring new products to consumers. They were just sort of, lazing around and sort of following each other on price increases, which is really, really a bad outcome for consumers because they end up paying higher prices and they get lower quality and less innovation. Go ahead.
And which is called, and again, and I don't know if there was any collusion here or any official, overt collusion, but it sounds kind of like price fixing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's short of price fixing. So,
okay.
Really good observation from you there. Price fixing is when you meet in a smoke-filled room and you decide with your rivals that you're not going to compete and you're going to fix prices or you're going to divide up markets or whatever, but you're not going to compete. Tacit collusion is a little more subtle than that, and what we found after the Miller Coors JV in terms of the higher prices is that it really was sort of tacit collusion. They were following each other. So that's kind of the lay of the land. Okay, so now here comes this new deal, this new proposed deal, where AB-Inbev and SABMiller would join together in a merged firm. Well, okay, so SABMiller is a big global brewer, right? They too have gained their position in the global industry through a series of previous mergers. What would happen is the Miller Coors JV would be essentially dismantled. The Miller part of the JV goes over to AB-Inbev. So then you'd have a firm with close to 60% of the market, right? And that really starts raising red flags. When you get a firm in any market with 60%, even 50%, we call those dominant firms. Those firms have a lot of market power. They can move price. They can control the price. They can dictate terms to suppliers and to customers and distributors. And you don't get competitive outcomes when you have a big kahuna firm sort of sitting in the market like that. So that's essentially what has been proposed, is that AB-Inbev would pick up the Miller assets, but so here's the rub. The companies know that would be a problem for antitrust enforcers, that would be sort of a no-go to create a firm with 60% of the market in brewing capacity. So what they've proposed is to divest the Miller part over to Molson Coors. So they've been very strategic in how they've sort of structured this deal. You know, they want this merger, but in the United States, they're willing to depart with the Miller assets by pushing them over, divesting them to Molson Coors. So basically, there would be no change in the structure of the U.S. beer market other than changing the name on the door from Miller Coors to Molson Coors. All right? So then you say, okay, well, why would they even do that? Like, what do they get out of a deal like that in the U.S.? And the answer is not a heck of a lot, because the deal is really motivated by the company's interest in expanding their global footprint. They want to get they want to get to consumers in expanding beer markets in Latin America, in Africa, Asia. You know, they want to expand their distribution networks globally. So this deal, let me put it this way, this deal is really motivated by global aspirations to become the global dominant brewer. But there is a U.S. component to it because of SABMiller's interest in the Miller Coors joint venture. So they have to deal with U.S. antitrust concerns. And the way they're dealing with that is to say, okay, you know, we're just going to move Miller over to Molson Coors. So Miller's out, and it's going over to Molson Coors. Molson Coors will now be sort of the new Miller Coors in the market. And they will have that same 26% of the market, and AB-Inbev will have that same 45% of the market. So that all sounds really great. And, like, why would we even worry about that? It just sounds like we're changing the name on the door. And unfortunately, it is much more complicated than that, because the Department of Justice will have to figure out whether that divestiture to Molson Coors of the Miller assets is actually gonna protect competition and restore competition lost by that merger.
Right. It sounds kind of like it's saying, okay, we don't, in America, we don't have any interest or influence or ownership in America in Miller or Coors. Wink, wink. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, if globally they do own them, maybe
right.
Not technically on paper, that org chart goes all the way to AB-Inbev, but in closed-door meetings that happen in Amsterdam or Sweden or Switzerland or Ireland or Spain, I would have a feeling that there would still be a whole lot of influence coming down from AB-Inbev to Miller Coors senior managers or leaders in America. And maybe that's just speculation on my part, but that's just kind of what my instincts tell me.
Yeah, and that's remember, so antitrust enforcement, every country in the world has an antitrust enforcer. They've got competition laws, and they've got enforcers that enforce the laws. In the United States, we've probably got the oldest system in the world, and we're concerned about the effect of mergers, including this merger, on the U.S. markets and the U.S. consumers. So we have to sort of limit our focus to the U.S. and the effect on competition in the U.S. beer market, the national market, and all of these sort of more local markets that are going to be defined. But that doesn't change the fact that if you have these big global companies who are able to import different brands, to engage in strategic product positioning and importing and that sort of thing, that definitely affects the U.S. market. So it is important to consider the global footprint of these companies and their brand portfolios and their ability to strategically position themselves in the U.S. That does play into how the U.S. Beer markets, how they're structured and how competition occurs in those markets. So if the story stopped right there, most people would walk away saying, well, this doesn't look like it's really a problem. They're going to divest the Miller assets. It's going over to Molson Coors, and there's no real change in market shares, and it's like nothing happened other than we changed the name on the door. And unfortunately, that's not the whole story, and that's where the craft brewing segment of the story comes in. That's sort of like chapter 2 or maybe chapter 3.
And so how would, in your view, how could this impact the craft brewer, this merger? What does it mean to us?
Okay, so to figure out what the effect on smaller competitors, craft brewers is you have to sort of pretend like you never heard about this divestiture proposal, that the Miller assets would go over to Molson Coors. You have to sort of suspend reality and say, and this is what the DOJ will do. They'll say, okay, what is the effect of this deal? Well, like I said, the deal takes AB-Inbev with 45% of the market, and it would combine it with Miller's part of the joint venture, about 13% of the market, to create a bigger brewer. All right, so forget about the divestiture, the proposed divestiture of Miller over to Molson Coors. The DOJ is going to start from scratch. They're going to start from square one, and they're going to say, okay, this merger creates a bigger firm, creates a bigger brewer, and only then, when they fully understand what the effects of that bigger, new bigger brewer are on competition and consumers, can the DOJ then say, okay, well, if this merger is fixable, what should the fix be? And in other words, is the proposal to move Miller over to Molson Coors an adequate fix? And our concern is that may not be an adequate fix. This is a pretty anti-competitive merger, and so we shouldn't just assume that moving Miller over to Molson Coors is going to fix the problem. There may need to be another remedy, or a stronger remedy, or a different kind of remedy, if the deal is even fixable. The deal may not be fixable. We haven't sort of, opined on that, but we've certainly raised the possibility. So back to the craft brewer. How does it affect the craft brewer, and how does it affect consumers of beer in the U.S.? Well, you now have a bigger firm with 60% of the market. AB-Inbev is integrated very, very strongly and aggressively into distribution, right? They own distribution. They have contracts. They have their own distribution scattered throughout the country, and they have contracts with independent distributors. And they are known for having pretty aggressive contracts with their independent distributors that gives the indies, we call them the indies, incentives to favor the brands of AB-Inbev over smaller rival brands. So whenever you take a company that has a beer company that has brewing capacity, and they'd now be bigger after the merger, and you put that together with control over the pipeline to the consumer, so the whole distribution system, which is important for getting beer out of the breweries and onto trucks and onto retail shelves and into the hands of the consumer. If you put those two things together, you have a potentially toxic problem for any competitor of the companies. And this is where the craft brewers could really be harmed, because as a bigger brewer, ABI would have every incentive to sell their own stuff and encourage independent distributors to carry their own brands over the brands of rival craft brewers. And that's the rub. That's really where the craft brewer comes into the picture. So remember, if you control distribution and you're a big player and you have a lot of market power, then you potentially have incentives to keep your rivals out and to get your own products into the hands of the consumer instead. And that doesn't give the consumer any choice. Consumers want choice and quality, and they want innovative products. And we know that because there's a huge craft brewing revolution in this country. We know consumers want those high-quality products. And unfortunately, the merger would make it more difficult for those craft brewers to compete effectively.
Now, Diana, when it comes to distributors, right? Like we know that I just say Budweiser loosely, but Budweiser owns distributors in America. Now, these distributors that they own and slash heavily influence if they don't own them with these indies, are they owned by the entity AB-Inbev? So are they owned by a global AB-Inbev? Are they owned by just Anheuser-Busch? Are they one and the same?
Well, I think for purposes of looking at this, the effect of this merger on competition in the U.S. and U.S. consumers, the fact that they're owned and controlled by AB-Inbev is really what matters. Okay, so think of it as two buckets of distribution. AB-Inbev has their own distributors, their wholly owned distributors, where they have they distribute their own products,